All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to ASEV Eastern Section Hang Time, Grapevines to Wine. I used to be a lunch hour. It's not really a lunch hour for some people, but it's just a fun hour that we can join together and discuss relevant issues across this country, things that we all encounter in our vineyards, in our wineries. And so we've done this monthly and had some great response. Hopefully we'll see our numbers jump in as we get started here. The format of this series is to have a conversation with specialists across the country, and for it to be conversational, not just a presentation. So we want to encourage y'all that if you want to ask questions, what you would do is there is a hand raise, or in the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, you raise your hand. It should take your name to the top of the participants list. I got some of our panelists here helping me keep an eye on questions in both the well, we ask that you, if you want to type a question in, put that in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And if you want to verbally ask a question, raise your hand and I will unmute you and we can do that. So feel free, don't be shy. We will record these series we have on ASEV Eastern Section YouTube page, and so you can share those this recording later on. All right, are we good to go, panelists?
Sure.
All right. Well, y'all, let's start with Kane. Why don't you introduce yourselves, and then we'll get started with the discussion.
Sure. Good morning from the East Coast. Good afternoon, or no, good morning everywhere, I guess, at least if you're in the United States. An earlier good morning to you if you're further west than us in Pennsylvania. My name is Kane Hickey. I am an assistant teaching professor of viticulture at Penn State.
Me. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Aude Watrelot. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist of enology at Iowa State University. So close to Penn State in the Midwest.
All right, Chris.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Gerling. I'm a senior extension associate at Cornell Agritech in Geneva, New York. So happy to see all of you across the East, whatever the East may mean to you.
Right. Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria Smith. I'm the viticulture outreach specialist at Ohio State University. So kind of the transition between the East and the Midwest, but still very much the northern part of the US in terms of viticulture regions. Very glad to be here.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming. There's a reason that each of you were invited, and that was your specialty in viticulture or enology or food sciences background, because today's topic is to hang or not to hang, and for how long. Are we compromising phenols and compounds for just Brix at the end of the day? And this is a discussion that, we have probably across the country, and every state's going to have its own interpretation of when to harvest grapes. But from an academic point of view, I thought ASEV Eastern Section is a great platform to just have this academic discussion talk and look at the sciences behind it. And so while we have some enologists on the panel and some viticulture, I thought I wouldn't pitch you against each other, but we could play it from a point of a vineyard grower, a vine grower, a grape grower. So we all have our vineyard managers in the field. We can relate this to industry. And we also have our enologist in the academic world, or our winemakers in the industry. So I've kind of pre-upped y'all on some of the discussions of what we want to discuss. And I don't know where we can get started. We got an outline here. So why don't we talk about let's start with the vineyard side of things. So in some of these vineyard side of things, we consider our rot development versus chemistry and various cultivars. We did discuss, in our pre-meeting, are we losing tonnage by some of the leaving our grapes out there, losing some juice volume. And what are traditional harvest times in the past, labor considerations, and obviously we have in a vineyard, we got logistics. Our wineries may only be so big. So who wants to chime in, starting with maybe from the viticulture side? Kane, take it away.
Okay, well, look, this is an academic society, so just on behalf of all the panelists here, I do want to say that I did not go through an extensive literature review before today's webinar. So the things that I'll say are very heavily and likely supported by science, but as an extension person who goes out and talks to growers across the variable vintages we have in the East Coast, I'll say some of the things I say may or may not be published, right? And so I just want to get that out of the way, because I think some of the things we see, we do observe, and we observe, and many of us as scientists would say it's anecdote, but you can't discount anecdote, right? Because they are observations. And so unless this is going to be submitted for a peer review publication, let us just speak candidly about the things we see. All right. Now that public service announcement's out of the way, the reality is we are always on the East Coast, not always, but in many vintages, we are caught between the idea of fruit quality from a sanitary and cleanliness and disease standpoint versus chemistry, right? Those are the two factors at play. Is what chemistry are we trying to achieve? And at what cost is it to what we would call fruit cleanliness or fruit integrity? And in general, it seems like the longer that you hang fruit in some vintages, you play, there's a higher risk of rot to develop. And this is where I really, we're talking about wine grapes in this instance, and so wine grapes are processed, and so it's up to the winemakers as to how much of that rotten fruit they want to process, because you're not selling the fruit itself to the consumer, you're selling wine. And so that's something that, as a viticulturist, I'd never want to see rot, right? But a winemaker might be okay with some rot because they're like, look, we're just going to crush all this anyways, right? And so that's something that I don't know, I couldn't speak to, right? But just to kick things off, because it's the first bullet point, Nathan, that you have here is rot development versus chemistry. Some wine styles, and I think Chris and Ode would agree, are easier to achieve and get away with less rot, such as rosés or sparkling wines, which might be harvested earlier because the chemistry you're looking for has higher acid and low sugar content. So I'll stop there and kick it over to my other viticulture colleague, Maria, to take it over.
Yeah, so along the same caveat as Kane, at least in extension, there's a big difference between expectations versus reality when it comes to when to harvest fruit, and also so many things to actually have to think about. And so I was going to more approach this from it's 2023, and we've had a number of seasonal challenges that to me are really important. The first is going to be the frost event that we had in May, which may lend itself to differences in terms of fruit ripening and uniformity, especially among the secondary cluster. So you might see some very advanced fruit fully through veraison at this point and some very green fruit, and wondering what are you going to do with that. The other thing is what type of rot we're actually getting. And for us, it seems like in the past several years, and maybe this year too, a lot of that's going to be sour rot, instead of what you would consider good rot, for whatever that's worth, if there is such a thing, unless you're talking about noble rot and botrytis. But yeah, style matters, variety matters a lot. Of course, not everything has to be what we would consider 21 Brix or optimal. Optimal maturity is defined more by variety than a lot of other parameters, and by style of wine, as Kane has already alluded to. And then the other thing with the sour rot situation this year is I've seen a lot of berry split over the past 3 weeks from various events. We've had a couple of hail events in Ohio that's caused splitting and bruising. Surprisingly, I've seen a lot of Inspire Super and Rivas Top damage that's causing splitting now, even though the berries were damaged maybe back in June. And that's mostly in relation to some of the Minnesota cold hardy hybrids. And then just various random splitting, whether that's from how dry we were in June and possible high precipitation that we saw in early July causing split, or possibly thrips because insects have been more problematic this year than they have in past years too. So
you
that's where
saying
I
y'all-
was going to start.
Are you saying y'all have insects and sour rot up in Ohio too?
Yeah. The other thing that I think gets ignored a lot is bee pressure has been really, really bad the past several years. That has driven a lot of harvest decisions too, right? Because bees, birds, rain are the three main causes of our berry split. And when we actually end up harvesting, even though we would love to all reach that prime consideration for whatever our goal optimal maturity happens to be.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So one question was about how do you define rot? But then the other question I have is, do you use the weather station to identify when a rot is gonna occur or not really? How do you define, or how often do you go in the vineyard to check out the quality of the grapes, and what tools do you use to identify those?
I mean, you should be looking routinely, whether that's daily or weekly. And that includes measuring your own fruit maturity, right? Like good viticulturists should be out there on a weekly basis, about like starting around 10 Brix-ish and measuring that up until they decide to harvest, right? Or whenever winemakers want to harvest. And to me, rot is more of a percentage than anything else. They're like, if you see your berries are damaged, you're going to have rot sooner rather than later, right? Especially if it rains. And so I would say looking more at forecasts versus past rain events is more important, but maybe Kane can also chime in on that.
So there was a question about how you define rot. You know, you use your eyes and you look at the cluster, and if it's rotting, that's rot, right? But you'd have to plate it out to figure out what exact microorganisms, fungal pathogens are causing that, right? So again, not trying to get deep down into the weeds as to if it's sour rot and what complex of organisms cause that versus botrytis versus ripe rot. I mean, decaying fruit is what I would define as rot if I'm a commercial vineyard owner, right? And then I would communicate that to the winemaker as to, hey, well, you know, is this an acceptable percentage? Tim mentioned in the observations, Tim Martinson, a longtime extension associate at Cornell, said that folks tend to be somewhat tolerant of some rotten Riesling. Riesling is a rot sensitive cultivar. I think most would consider it. And so to reach some of the maturity parameters thereafter, I think you have to be a little bit flexible in terms of rot. Maybe not as much as in other cultivars. Going back to what Maria said about cultivars, it seems that some cultivars are very sensitive to splitting. One that comes to mind is Cayuga White. Whereas other cultivars can be a little bit more resilient to rain events without big jumps in changes in cluster integrity or maturity. I'm thinking about things like Petit Verdot or Petit Mansing that tend to have small berries, and they don't tend to, at least as we can tell, swell up and don't get diluted as much. They still can produce pretty decent Brix levels and don't get diluted. Those cultivars also have a high amount of acid. So I'm wondering if it's just like a berry size thing and they resist dilution effects, right? So
Actually, I was reading a lot about this in the past week from Marcus Keller, who's done a lot of work in like skin mechanics, berry skin mechanics in the past few years. It actually has to do with like structure of cell walls, which I thought was really interesting. So it does vary variety to variety and based on genetic parentage to some effect. One thing I wanted to add though to the which rot are we looking at and talking about? And so, yeah, I would agree with Kane that it doesn't matter necessarily much to the outcome of the fruit quality, right? Rot's gonna be rot, and it's gonna contribute to off flavors, aromas, and all sorts of problems in the wine. It does matter what rot we're talking about when it comes to controlling throughout the season, though, and I think that's really important to note because, like, ripe rot can be managed by Captan at veraison and at bloom, but botrytis, there are specific botrycides that we use at veraison and at bloom. And then sour rot's not something that you start managing until you talk about like 12, 15 plus Brix on up through harvest. So that I would say does matter a lot. And there's only so much we can do, especially for sour rot. Berry breakage is number one. But then there are some things that you can do to manage various types of rot. So I do want to include that.
I just want to interject that, sometimes here in Georgia, it's, some people have allowed some of that botrytis rot. So let's kind of pretend that the botrytis rot, a form of botrytis rot could be a benign kind of a rot, but it does cause rot and dehydration of the fruit and that raisioning effect. Chris, we had kind of talked about this the other day, like, okay, that might be a good thing, but again, you're losing volume. So from the winemaking side of things, I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. Yeah. It's as we're talking about here, there's all these trade-offs you have to make, and there's risks that are being taken. And one of the big things I think is who's taking that risk, right? So if you're buying, if a winery is buying grapes from a grape grower and they're distinct entities, and we're talking about a loss in yields for whatever reason, right? Whether it's dehydration or desiccation from disease or from all various things, who's taking that risk, right? If you're just agreeing to pay by the ton, then you're asking the vineyard to take on all that risk, and that not necessarily a fair thing to do. And so then you start talking about like maybe an acreage contract or something like that. If you're asking, if you're seeking out a volume loss, and so you can make great wines that way, sure. And you're less volume, but you can, there's cool things you can do in that space. I've made wines where botrytis was one of the featured elements, and so that can you can make some really cool wines that way. But it does call for different considerations from the aforementioned. What are we doing about the fact that we have a lot less volume here, and who's paying for that, basically? Are we sorting? I think sorting is a part of the equation here that we can think about. It's I like a relative once was showing me this video of this winery in Napa that they had stupendous dry farm grapes, and the quality was extraordinary, and they were showing how they sorted it like 6 times, and I was like, this fruit does not need to be sorted. Every berry is exactly the same. You can count them, and then over here in the East, where we could probably use sorting way more often, we often don't have the resources to do that for a variety of reasons. A lot of sorting doesn't happen as much as it could happen, or maybe should happen. And so but that's something to play into this, do you have the ability to sort? Do you have the wherewithal? Do you have the to do that? Because that can definitely change what's coming out of of how many wine lots are coming out of such a section of grapes. Because as we say, all rots are not equal, and maybe need to be dealt with differently, but do you have the ability to do that?
So how does that look like in a conversation between a grape grower and a winemaker? Let's talk about what both parties need to consider together, and maybe pre-season, some of y'all's rules of, good rules of practice pre-season. Let's all sit down. Obviously, the glaring response is, well, you got to decide what wine styles you want and what you're after, but you got to look at the economics behind it. So these are easy answers, but maybe we can break that apart a little bit if anybody wants to jump in.
Yeah, I want to let other people talk, but the one thing I wanted to just talk about is, one word also that doesn't get used around a lot in my neck of the woods or whatever is contracts, because everyone's like, well, contract, does that mean lawyers? Does that mean enforcement? Does that mean somebody's going to get in trouble? Somebody's going to get sued if this goes sideways for whatever reason? And I don't have another person to sell grapes to. I don't have another person to buy grapes from. So what does it matter? Like, right? We're both tied to each other. So what's the point? And I agree with all those things. I mean, I understand all those things. But the thing about a piece of paper is you could write out expectations, right? This is what we're going for. This is what the winery wants. This is what the vineyard expects. these are our aims, and these are what we might do. If something starts to go a little bit off plan, this is our bias. We'd rather harvest early and maintain the yield. We'd rather harvest late and take those risks, and then I'll talk about how you're going to take those on. Just having expectations and knowing where everybody's coming from isn't necessarily the end of the world. Even if you never expect to, quote unquote, enforce the contract, if you talk about expectations and what you're going to do, what your plan B is or your plan C, which we often need, that's not such a bad thing. So, all right, I'm off my soapbox now.
And I think the communication between the vineyard manager and the winemaker is really important at the early stage throughout the season, especially when we don't know what the climate is going to be or how the season is gonna be. For example, what Maria mentioned about the frost that happened in May, that's gonna have an impact on the growing characteristics of the grapes. Same in Iowa, we had a pretty hot week, like at Verizon. And so that's gonna probably delay a little bit the time of harvest. So I think the earlier the discussion happens between those different parties, the better it is just to establish plans for the season. And also just checking at all the chemistry, not only the Brix, because it doesn't do that much to know how much is the Brix, but looking at all the basic chemistry. pH is pretty important. Titratable acidity is also important. And then just the aroma compounds. What are the aroma that you can expect, and what are the types of wine you want to make? But everything should be considered together, I think.
Yeah, I agree with Ode. I said Brix because most growers have refractometers and not necessarily pH meters and titration equipment. So yes, I would say the onus could be more on the winery to make sure they're checking the other parameters that they want. The other important one that I think gets ignored a lot, especially in Ohio, is YAN, yeast assimilable nitrogen, because that can be altered in the vineyard to an extent by fertilization management. So I did want to add something to contracts, because one of the best contracts I had ever seen gives incentives for growers to do things with a baseline expectation of the way that you manage canopy, spray schedules, and whatnot, but giving incentive for being able to achieve a certain set of quality parameters in terms of Brix, pH, and TA. So maybe you start at a baseline of, say, 18 Brix, 2.9 pH, whatever, 9 grams per liter TA, and then bump that up as you can to say, maybe I'll give you an extra 5 cents per pound or 2 cents per pound for each level of quality parameter, or for various yield targets, or whatever the case may be. Could be a good way to approach how you negotiate whatever that final price is, so that you can account for potential differences in risks year over year.
Well, let's transition. We've kind of brought up YAN levels. Let's kind of just flip the script over to the enology side a little bit. What are things that we can control? Obviously, what are things that we can control in the winery? We at our pre-meeting, we kind of discussed, obviously you have your pH, your TA, your sugar, and your YAN levels. We got SO2. And so what are things that we can fix in the winery?
I think we can fix many things, but people shouldn't consider that they don't have to do anything in the vineyard first, because we always need good grapes before starting to make adjustment in the winery. But then if we have not enough sugar, we can increase sugar concentration. If we have not enough acidity, we can add acids to manage that acidity. If you have not enough YAN or nitrogen, you can add some ferment K just to change a little bit that levels, or you can decide to use specific yeast strains just that will be active under specific level of nitrogen. So there is a lot of things that we can do, but we should always look at what is the chemistry of the grapes initially. Also, for going back on the rot, so I have been discussing with a winemaker in Michigan who has a flash détente unit, which is thermovinification, and he was saying that for some varieties, depending on how bad or how much rot it can be on those grapes, he might use the flash détente unit to get rid of those bacteria and all those fungus and other things. So flash détente, that's a pretty big unit, very, very expensive, but that was just interesting to hear about his perspective about quality of grapes that he's processing using that unit.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, what Oda said, and I just talking about yan, sugar, acid, these things, we can buy these things, we can add these things. But we have to be very careful with, one of the things like with nitrogen, you can increase nitrogen content of grapes through fertilization in the vineyard, but you'd have to, I don't ever want to have a winery dictating how a vineyard should be managed just for yan alone, because you need to do what your vines need, and you don't want to over fertilize a vineyard just to increase yan, because yan is something we can pretty precisely dose in the winery, and we don't want throwing your vineyard out of balance, getting through over fertilization and all the other problems that will be associated with that, versus dialing that in. But that being said, sugar and acid, as Ode said, we can add sugar, but if we're having to add a lot of sugar, it probably means that there's more issues we're going to have besides just sugar alone in terms of the overall quality of the fruit. So, it's once again, we want to be kind of holistic in both cases about how we're managing things so that we have a product that works in both cases for both the vineyard and the winery.
Yeah, I should have added a caveat that that's usually through foliar fertilization, which does not typically throw your vine crazy out of balance. Plus, we should really be measuring our vine nutrient status at veraison. And a lot of times it's easy to skip because that's when you're like, oh, it's, the pre-harvest time. We want to go on that last week of summer vacation kind of a thing. It's really easy to skip. But is, to me, very important to do, because we're not talking about like a little bit of dosing. We're talking about very, very low yan levels that can show up when you have some slight nitrogen deficiencies, or at least that I've noticed. And it comes across a lot in white varieties that I've seen here in Ohio.
And to add a little bit about the acid adjustment. So that's where it's getting tricky, because depending on where you are in the US, you don't have exactly the same pH, the same titratable acidity. And so sometimes, for example, in Texas, they had really high pH above 4.0, sometimes 4.6 that happened. That's crazy. But they have also low TA. And so in those conditions, that's pretty challenging for them just to adjust the pH and the titratable acidity. And so I don't know if you were, some of you at the ASEV Eastern Section conference last June, but Dr. Botezatu from Texas A&M did a presentation about verjus, which is a green juice. So that's based on using clusters that are thinned during the season, so before harvest time. They are pretty high in acid, and so that's what they use to process. So when they process wine, they use those verjus, so those green clusters, to decrease the pH and increase the titratable acidity. So that's something that's currently happening. But also, depending on if you are in Iowa, you're going to have high pH and high TA, which is much more difficult to manage. Because if you want to reduce the pH, at the same time, you're going to potentially increase the TA, which is not what we want. And so that's also a challenge going back on sulfur dioxide. So if you have a high pH, you're going to have to add a lot of sulfur dioxide, which is not what a winemaker wants, because there is a legal limit and you don't want to use too much neither. So that's just a lot of different things to consider for the acid.
All great points of view. We're rolling. Let's talk about weather. Here in Georgia, we have the hurricane season, and even here in the North Georgia mountains, The hurricanes that come up the Gulf will swing around across the Appalachian Mountains and can dump on us. So sometimes, we're sitting at 17, 18 Brix, would love to get it to that 21. And it's just not practical when you think of if you have a 20-acre vineyard to harvest, you got to start sometimes to just the timing that it takes to get through that. Kane, one thing that when you were here in Georgia that I found extremely interesting, and it was just me learning, was when we were measuring berry chemistry, we have this exponential ripeness of increasing sugars, but then we got kind of towards the end and it plateaued off. And so we could have let a block rest for another or hang for another 2 weeks, but what the results showed, you may have increased only a brick during that 2 weeks. And the question is the risk worth the reward? So didn't know if you wanted to give some remarks on, how we see that berry chemistry, the ripening, and then kind of slow down towards the end.
Yeah, I just think that on the East Coast where we do see some precipitation, that the changes, like Maria mentioned earlier, the changes we want to see don't necessarily result in them actually happening, right? So the idea is if you hang longer, that the chemistry is going to change in your favor, and that's not necessarily true. I think it could be in arid climates, at least if you want to see an increase in Brix. And in a lot of times in arid, dry climates, they don't want to see an increase in Brix. They want to see a slowing down of Brix, and so everything else can kind of be in balance. But in our cases, and in some vintages more than others, and in some cultivars more than others, I'm not going to go out on a limb and say what cultivars. I have an idea, but sometimes you just don't see those changes you want to see. And then if rot has gone up, whether it be bunch rots, and again, I do want to thank Maria for talking about the different management strategies of rots later in the season. But let's just say in general, rots are unwanted, then what have you achieved? Have you increased pH? Brix has stayed the same, rot has gone up. Like, what are the risks versus the rewards that you're after? And so this kind of becomes a question for me, especially to Ode and Chris, is, and this is something that I've asked winemakers and I've heard different answers, is would you rather add acid or add sugar? Because if you hang, sometimes you don't get the sugar increase, but you do see acid start to drop off in some situations, or the pH go up. But as far as a final product, would the winemaker prefer to add acid or prefer to add sugar in terms of that not having an impact on the final product, or less of a negative impact on the final product, if that's a thing?
I can start, but maybe we would have a different opinion. I don't know. I would think it's easier to add sugar than acids, because when you add acids, you can have some reaction happening, especially with potassium. Some varieties are really rich in potassium. And so you know that when you have too much potassium, but you add, or you have high concentration of tartaric acid, that's a way where you can get the potassium bitartrate crystals form. So I would think that would be easier to add sugar, but at the same time, you don't want to have too much alcohol. And you, as Chris mentioned earlier, you don't want to have too many issues if you have too much sugar, because if you don't make sure your bacteria are gone, or white yeast are gone during winemaking, you can have re-fermentation sometimes if you still have sugar remaining in your wine. So yeah, that's my opinion. But then I don't know Chris, what would you say?
Well, yeah, I think it really depends, right? Because what varieties are we talking about here? We have this huge spectrum of grapes across the East. So you've got your Minnesota varieties, your cold climate varieties, where it's common for them to get to like 25 degrees Brix, right? Or higher sometimes, depending on where they are. But also their TA could be 18 grams per liter or whatever, if they don't. And so you want to sort that out, depending on where you are and what you're seeing. We were talking about how Cayuga White, for example, is, the danger with Cayuga White is often for being overripe. we often are afraid that, if it gets above 18 degrees Brix or whatever, we might see kind of characters that we don't like in it. Some varieties are more medium. Riesling seems to be able to tolerate 19 to 22. You can make high quality wines from all of those things. Then you've got like your Cabernet Franc, your Cabernet Sauvignon, the later vinifera, things like that, where if the reds, if those are underripe, we're seeing more problems. Things like methoxypyrazines that have not effectively been degraded, basically. And so depending on the wine style you're after, the grapes you're dealing with, I think there's more or less danger from underripeness or overripeness, to use kind of blanket terms, sparkling wine. So there's all those go along with what what are you trying to achieve. I think is depends on and what problem what deficiency you're more comfortable with, I guess, would be my weasel way out of it. Yeah.
And also it depends on, so as you mentioned, the type of wine you want to do. So if you have grapes that are really low in Brix, but the pH or the acidity is a little bit acidic, that would be a perfect sparkling wines, probably, but also depending on the cultivar. So some cultivars would have that foxy aroma, especially on hybrids from Labrusca species. So if you wait too long, you're gonna have probably, sure, you're gonna have sugar, but is it really what you want to have for a wine? That if you try making wine with a high sugar content, at some point you may have all those foxy characteristics that you don't really want in those wines. It depends on the consumer's perception, but so that's also something to consider. Not only looking at the chemistry or the basic chemistry parameters, I should say, but also looking at what wine you want, but also the flavors and phenolics. That's also important.
Ode and Chris, I'll play the county agent role for a minute. I want you to educate me and tell me about aromas. We talk about all these phenols and compounds and things like that. And some of these things we can measure, but ultimately, when you have nose feel and you're trying to get hints of different characteristics, what's the realities behind aromas? We kind of talked about this the other day, how many there are, what's controllable, what's not.
You want me to go first this time or whatever?
Go
for it. I'll go first, and Ode can correct me. So right. So I mean, so when we go beyond the basic chemistry, sugar, acid, nitrogen, to these kind of more hard to define, hard to quantify, flavor, aroma, quality parameters, it gets difficult fast because as there are some compounds that will persist from grape to juice to wine, like the methoxypyrazine, the green bell pepper character you can get in some of those Bordeaux varieties. Like if you smell that and taste that in the grapes, you're going to get that in the wine. Like that's, so that's there. So we can see that happen. So we want, there's ways to hopefully get that out of there. It accumulates early in the season and then it degrades, and we hope we get enough, either minimal accumulation or maximum degradation or whatever it takes to get down below sensory threshold with that one. Now, a lot of the other things that we consider aromatic, volatiles, wine, aromas, all the amazing things that we associate with good wine, it gets tricky there because, in the juice, we've got maybe 100 of these aromatic compounds, and in the wine, we've got thousands. And so when we're tasting grapes, when we're smelling grapes, juice, all those kind of things, these are precursors, right? These are not the final product. The yeast are going to work with these precursors and make all sorts of amazing things, compounds. And so it's really hard to know, in the grape, what we're going to wind up with in the wine. And I think that we generally know, and in the broadest sense, that riper grapes seem to give us more of these good ones. If it's underripe or it's overripe, we get less of the good ones or more of the bad ones, or some combination thereof. But it's a precursor conversation with grapes and juice. And so It's hard to know for sure what you're going to wind up with, I think, is my big answer. And then Ode, who knows much more about phenol chemistry and everything like that, can weigh in here. So.
But yeah, talking about the aroma compounds still. So as you mentioned, there are some in the grapes, but then throughout the winemaking process, you're going to have much more. But also it depends on the environment. So if you have smoke from a white fire, that's really a hot topic right now. Hot, I don't mean, but so if you are close, if your vineyard is close to a fire, white fire, you may have some smoke coming in contact with the grapes. And so that are compounds that will be biosynthesized or transformed by the yeast. And so those new aroma compounds would be formed. And it's not only, so when we talk about aroma compounds, it can be good, but it can be bad, depending on what you have in the grapes initially. So that was really for the aroma. It really depends on, do you want to wait before harvesting, depending on the climate, but also what's happening around your area. And so for phenolics, that's always challenging. That's always complex because we always wait the longest we can just to get those pigments. So anthocyanin, the colors of the grapes for the red grapes, but also we try to get some of the tannin that we can in the skins and in the seeds, but depending on where you are in your location, you may have issues to get those out of the grapes when you make wine, especially depending on the varieties. And that's going back on the structure of the skins that you mentioned, Maria. Sometimes if you have a skin that is really thick, I think that's one of the issues when we try to get tannin from the skins, because of the texture, they are not really easy to extract. So we can wait the longest we can, but at some point, if the berries are really thick, it's going to be really challenging to get those tannin, meaning that when you make a wine, it's going to be pretty difficult to get that mouthfeel, that astringency mouthfeel, depending on the cultivars that you have. So not really on vinifera, but that's one of the issues that we have for Cote Hardy grapes.
And when we talk about the eastern section, every state's doing something a little different. There's different varieties, different cultivars. And to me, that's just the power of this organization and in the research that goes on. And the point of sharing, the point of this is as you know, every state has breeding, well, not every state does, but the breeding programs that do exist, that they're bringing in new cultivars that we don't know some of these things and how they're going to react in the winery and how long. And it's all brand new in a sense. I always compare it to Europe. You know, they've been growing grapes for thousands of years. There's laws, and this is how you do it. And for us here in America, and specifically to our audience, the eastern section, we have flexibility, but it's a good thing, and it can be a scary thing. There may be new wine styles that have yet to even come out of certain varieties, and that's exciting to me.
Speaking of, Nathan, you're in Georgia. Can you spend like 2 minutes on muscadines?
Well, what do you want to know? They're typically for muscadines in Georgia. So it used to be that it was said that we couldn't grow them up here. We're at about 14 to 1500 elevation right here in our area, and that they would not ripen in time. We see that that's not true. We can definitely get a solid harvest. We do have our muscadine breeder in Tifton, our South Georgia campus, but a lot of times he's breeding for fresh U-pick, or fresh market grapes, and not so much wine quality parameters. So in my mind, of course, Kane or somebody else may be able to help correct me. We have Carlos, and there's another one that's escaping me. That's one of the better. Kane, you know it? Noble. Carlos and Noble are kind of the two varieties that are better in winemaking characteristics. But when we had that deep freeze, the 22 acres of muscadines here in the county, we saw Carlos got hit pretty hard by those single digits. So, you know, but as you go down to South Georgia and Middle Georgia, where we don't have to worry so much about cold tolerance, We see a lot of excitement and energy. Obviously, muscadines kind of tend to cater to a sweet wine connoisseur, dessert kind of style wine, but for Georgia wineries and growers, in my opinion, everybody's trying to identify themselves as something, and somebody's geographically may be restricted to a certain variety. And so when we think about new growers coming into your states and Georgia, wherever they're starting, they've got to face the reality of their elevation, the pressures of rainfall and disease and insects, and what works well with their economic business plan. And that is where, I mean, you can have fun growing grapes, but at the end of the day, you want to sell them and make some money and pay for it. So, but yeah, so we're working with them. When Kane had left, we were looking at trellis vine density and a couple of different trellis designs. So for our southern states, Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi and Alabama, I look forward to having some of those specialists on future programs this year. But it's exciting, I think, still, but that's about as far as my knowledge will let me go.
I didn't know if you harvest them like Nebraska or if you harvest them like hybrid and vinifera wine grapes.
I don't know of too much mixing going on right now, and there may be some folks in the state doing that. I know that we've had some mixed with blackberries and things like that, and like as a value-added fruit. But
oh no, I meant like harvest parameters. Like Nebraska is often 12 to 14, 16 Brix. Vinifera and hybrids tend to be 18 to 24.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question.
Yeah, sorry.
If I believe correctly, and Sarah, our specialist is here, she may, I want to think it's around 15. Kane, do you recall whenever you were here, 15,
Yeah,
16?
it's lower. It's Nebraska-esque. It's somewhere between probably 12 and 16, depending on the cultivar. And and a lot of the muscadines are depending on if they're fresh market or processed. Some of the processing ones will be machine harvested, but fresh market, you need to hand harvest them to maintain integrity and reduce blemishes and things like that.
We have a little bit of time. I do have a question that's here. It says Riesling growers tend to be tolerant of some botrytis as long as it's not sour rot. Can you compare different rots in terms of impact on fruit wine quality? And I know we have addressed some of this, but maybe with an emphasis on the Riesling. Chris or Ode, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think we were talking about how, like, if we've got some botrytis or whatever, that's probably just, if it's just botrytis, it's probably okay. Once we get to sour rot and some other of the, then it's not as good. But overall, Riesling does seem to be able to tolerate it more, than others. Is my feeling. We did kind of talk about this somewhat already. I don't know if anybody there.
No, it also matters. I think it matters if it's active, or you can manage botrytis too to get it inactive and dried up on the cluster as well. And Chris, I don't know, or Ode, or maybe Maria, like I'm not sure, but I think in general it'd be nice to have it inactive rather than like actively sporulating and wet.
I mean, we sometimes, when we were sorting, we used to smell the clusters and like, does it smell like vinegar? Does it not? Okay, and just looking at it, you might not know because it might look kind of gross, but yeah, you could do those kind of things. And
yeah.
And one of the things that I've been thinking about for all this is, we talked about this a little bit in the beginning about harvest logistics and the reality of it, right? And we talked about rain, but there's so many other things that play into this all, right? Can you get pickers? Can you get the mechanical harvester? Is there tank space? Is the driveway, blocked right now because somebody's delivering something or whatever? Like all these things that so rarely do we get to actually pick the grapes on the day everybody says that'd be a great day to pick the grapes, and we're going to do it, right? There's so many different compromises you have to make, right? Because of just life. And that's when I think that the having the conversations, having the communication all throughout the season plays off. And you hope that, I think one of the things I heard earlier was you hope the first time you see the winemaker is not like the week before harvest, and they got the rubber boots on, and they're trying to be real serious vineyard people now and taking their samples, and this is the first time they've been there all season, right? That's not, you want them to have been doing much more conversation earlier.
So what I'm hearing from our panel is the age-old extension answer, it depends. And
no, totally. I actually wanted to talk about harvesters really quick, because mechanical harvesters are really, now that Chris brings up logistics, so we really haven't touched on this. We've gotten pretty deep into chemistry and theory about that, but we really haven't talked too much just about pragmatic logistics during harvest and what really happens. And something that I've seen in Pennsylvania, and let me define Pennsylvania by Lake Erie region, where the region I grew up in, where harvesters, you can see driving down Route 20 on any given day in October. They're normal, probably same thing in the Finger Lakes, compared to the rest of the state where there's smaller vineyards and mechanical harvesters are not as common. I've seen a lot of mechanical harvesters be purchased over the last couple of years in vineyards as small as 10 acres, 10, 12 acres, because they are tired of managing the vineyard all year, putting all these efforts, all the resources, time, sprays, and management, only to not be able to harvest exactly when they want to harvest because of lack of labor availability and an incoming storm. So I just think that, it's a debate, right? Oh, mechanically harvested fruit, you don't get to sort it, at least in the field. But on the other side, picking exactly when you want, that's a pretty good argument for optimizing quality, right?
And once again, I think it depends also on the type of wine you want to make. If you want to make like a Beaujolais Nouveau style, meaning a really early wine, you will need to harvest manually because you need to keep the food clusters. So the mechanical harvester would just take the berries, but you won't have the stems, which is important because you need the food clusters to start carbonic maceration.
Do we have any further questions from our audience? Now's a great time as we kind of get towards the end of our hour. Love to hear from you. And if there's any thoughts, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. Or you can ask in the Q&A box. And while we allow people to do that, just want to again thank each of you. This is a great topic and it's fun, right? Because I hear so many similarities, and Pennsylvania to Iowa to Ohio and Cornell. It's fun to bring these thoughts together. Again, here in Georgia, I'm presenting in front of 25 people here at a workshop live. So, they're absorbing all this in and hearing the similarities in other states that we have the same decisions that have to be made year after year on growing and harvesting and winemaking styles and practices. So be glad to open it back up to y'all if y'all had any last minute remarks and final words of wisdom as we approach harvest season.
Can we just do a quick go around about harvest time or the maturity parameters of specific cultivars you have in all our regions?
Absolutely.
I'm just wondering where everybody is in terms of maturity. How is it in Georgia?
Oh, okay. Do you want to start south to north then? Or?
Sure.
As far as Georgia, we're well on our way into veraison, obviously. I would see different things, different cultivars obviously are ripening at different stages. We'll have some that we'll harvest well into the end of September, whereas a lot of some of maybe Vidal Blanc and others may be harvested earlier on. Because of weathers and the forecast, the tropical forecast outlook, rosés have become very popular in Georgia, and of just going ahead and harvesting earlier and doing some blending. We're always harvesting kind of for after Labor Day and going through the fall. And I'm not the specialist here, so as across the state, we may have other thoughts on that. But Maria, how about you?
Well, I was almost late this morning checking in on our ripening conditions, and we're right at about 100% veraison in most of our varieties at this point. I think further northeast, they're further behind by about another week or two. And so we're probably going to start harvesting here in the next couple of weeks with our early varieties like Brianna, Itasca, and some others. And then we'll harvest up through around mid-October, depending on the cultivar and region. Cab Franc tends to be one of our latest, along with Chamberson and Norton. So we grow over 70 different cultivars, so it's pretty wide ranging.
Kane, how about Pennsylvania?
Southeast to northwest, it varies a lot. I think we did we're doing a phenology study, and bud break was as much as 2 to 2.5 weeks different across the state. So with that comes a difference in veraison starting, but in general, southeast, many are well into veraison. We'll probably start harvesting first, second week of September with early stuff. And I will put a plug in. We've kind of took the idea from Cornell, and we're starting a what we call post veraison in Pennsylvania project, where we're going to start reporting ripening parameters, at least primary chemistry, starting in the next couple of weeks, and will continue throughout harvest. So we will be posting weekly, hopefully weekly reports about ripening progress.
We also have that too. We have a post veraison to harvest maturity monitoring program that we've been running for a very long time. So
Yeah, ours is the same. We're pretty much as Pennsylvania. Veraison is happening throughout the state. It has happened in some places. It still has to happen in other places. Where down in Long Island, things are very different from up in the Adirondacks and out to Lake Erie. But we're going to start our sampling and reporting the week of the 28th of August. So that's when we think we're going to have berries that we can actually swish for chemistry, and we'll go from there and probably start harvest in September, and probably through all of October we'll be harvesting from early hybrids in Nebraska through to late vinifera.
And I think
Maria,
that's-
go ahead.
Yeah, that's the same in Iowa. So we started to, so veraison is 100% almost everywhere. And I've heard that one winery harvested La Crescent last week, which tended to be a little bit early, but it happens. And so we started to do that same report, checking maturity over time. So yeah, it's ongoing.
So just a quick question, we have to wrap it up, but Maria, maybe somebody for you. They had a hailstorm. What to look out for after this hailstorm, Marion County? I mean, my guess would be rot.
yeah, well, it's tough to say. So depending on when that hail happened, if it was a part of last week's storm, and I am familiar with this vineyard, if they're post veraison, yeah, rot's going to be a challenge for sure, because again, you're splitting open a maturing berry. If it happened before veraison and they were still green and hard, in a lot of cases, those berries have just shriveled up. So I would say if the cluster is very, very affected and you're getting close to harvest, take those clusters off. They're not going to be very salvageable. But that can be tough, depending on how severe the damage was.
Sounds good. As I conclude, if I can just ask our audience to type in what state you represent on here, that kind of helps us keep track of the audience that we're reaching. So as we wrap up here, if you'll just type in the chat box the state that you're representing. But to our panelists, thank you so much for the education, the discussion. It was great. That's exactly what I wanted, to have our viticulturists and our winemakers to have this discussion together. We hope this helps people across the country, and you look at these folks and they're great leaders in the industry, that ultimately they're accessible and as well as you talk to your local extension as well. So just wrapping up, next month, we're going to be talking about leaf change in the fall. We think of fall, we think of all leaf change and colors, but sometimes in the vineyard, that can be a good thing or a normal thing, and sometimes it can be a bad thing. So when we think of foliar color change in the vineyard, what is it? What could it be? So could it be possibly viruses, different things? So we've got some specialists from Texas that's going to be helping to talk on that. So we hope that you join us for that. And that date's going to be September 13th, same time, same place. So with that, everybody, thank you so much. We're going to depart. I'm going to stop recording here. Thank y'all for
Thank you.
coming.